For years, one name has struck fear across Australia's criminal underworld: Yoni Tan. Known as the nation's most dangerous drug lord, Tan built an empire that spanned continents, dealing in methamphetamine, cocaine, and ecstasy. His rise from a small-time operator to the most feared kingpin in the country is a story fueled by ruthless ambition and a network that seemed unstoppable. But how did one man manage to build such a vast and powerful operation? In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the story of Yoni Tan, his reign of terror, and how law enforcement finally brought his empire to its knees. Yoni Tan's journey didn't start with a bang or in the glamorous world of high-stakes crime. It began in the quiet suburbs of Melbourne in the early 1980s. Born into a working-class family, Tan grew up in an area where crime rates were high and opportunities were scarce. His parents worked tirelessly, but money was tight. Surrounded by poverty and hardship, Tan saw firsthand the struggles families endured and how some turned to crime just to survive. It didn't take long for him to realize that crime was a powerful tool in a world that seemed to leave people like him behind. As a teenager, Tan fell into the wrong crowd, not overnight, but gradually. Initially, his involvement wasn't driven by ambition or dreams of grandeur. He was simply seeking a way out of the grinding poverty that shackled him. The allure of easy money was irresistible. In these formative years, he began learning the ropes of street-level drug dealing, starting small by moving marijuana and other low-level substances on the less glamorous corners of Melbourne. It was far from the empire he would one day control, but it was a stepping stone, and the lessons learned in the streets would serve him well to be by his late teens. Tan was becoming known as a reliable figure in Melbourne's drug scene. His reputation for getting things done quietly and efficiently spread through the underworld. He had an innate ability to remain low-key, staying out of the spotlight while gaining respect from the city's criminal elite. His small-time operations expanded, and it became clear that Tan was not content with local deals. His ambition was growing, and he began thinking bigger than most others in the game. By his early 20s, Tan had made crucial connections with powerful figures in the underworld. He no longer sought to sell drugs on the streets. He wanted to control the flow of illicit substances in and out of the city. Tan's network of trusted associates began to grow, and with it, so did his reach. He became involved in international drug trade routes, particularly those from Southeast Asia, which were flooding Australia with heroin, methamphetamine, and ecstasy. Tan's power soon reached staggering heights. He gained access to networks and resources that enabled him to run large-scale operations. His reach expanded beyond local sales, and he became deeply embedded in the importation of illicit drugs. However, with this newfound power came new risks. Tan became embroiled in a murder investigation after orchestrating the killing of a mild-mannered accountant, a family man. But even as his criminal empire grew, Tan remained focused, always thinking several steps ahead. His ability to avoid detection was a key part of his success. By his mid-20s, Tan was no longer a small-time dealer. He was a dominant force in Melbourne's criminal world. His name was now recognized in the highest echelons of Australia's drug trade. His rise from humble beginnings to becoming one of the most feared figures in the underworld was well underway. Yoni Tan's story is one of ruthless ambition, a desire to break free from the limitations of his upbringing, and a willingness to take risks that others were too afraid to consider. The streets of his local neighborhood had transformed into a complex criminal network, and Tan was at the center of it all. The transition from small-time hustler to major player was swift, but meticulously calculated. Yoni Tan understood that to stay ahead in the game, he had to think bigger. He had to build an empire. His first major move came when he realized that Melbourne streets weren't the only places where money could be made. The Australian market for illicit drugs was expanding rapidly, and with it, the demand for more potent, more addictive substances. Marijuana and ecstasy pills were no longer enough. Methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine were now the high-stakes commodities that could turn a small-time dealer into a kingpin. To make this leap, Tan knew he needed to expand his network. He began forging relationships with suppliers outside of Melbourne, particularly in Southeast Asia, where large quantities of meth and heroin were being produced. But Yoni wasn't interested in just importing drugs. He wanted to control the entire supply chain, from production to transportation to distribution. This was the turning point in his criminal career. It was no longer about moving small amounts of drugs. It was about running an operation capable of generating millions in revenue. Over the next few years, Tan built a network that stretched far beyond Melbourne. He began making connections in Sydney, Brisbane, and even internationally, securing new routes and expanding his reach. His first few deals with international suppliers were nerve-wracking. He knew the risks. If one of his shipments was intercepted or one of his contacts betrayed him, it could all come crashing down. But Tan was fearless. He learned how to navigate danger from a young age, and he knew how to manage the risks. He worked only with trusted individuals and took every precaution to ensure his operations ran smoothly. Soon, Tan's operation was thriving. His drug shipments were arriving in Australia hidden within containers of legal goods. He had an entire logistics network in place, running drugs through the ports and distributing them across the country. While Melbourne remained his home base, his reach expanded to the point where no city was off limits. He had dealers in every major Australian city, each handling their own networks of buyers and pushing his product deeper into the country. Tan didn't just rely on the streets to manage his operation. He understood the importance of money laundering. He quickly established legitimate businesses as fronts for his drug empire, from restaurants to nightclubs. These businesses gave him the perfect cover for his illicit activities, serving as both money laundering hubs and safe meeting spots for his associates. They allowed him to operate without raising suspicion, keeping him one step ahead of the authorities. As his empire grew, Tan also realized the importance of staying out of the media spotlight. While other criminals craved attention and the power that came with it, he remained a shadowy figure. He was careful never to attract too much attention, preferring to stay behind the scenes while building a network of loyal, discreet individuals who would handle the dirty work. At the same time, Tan began to understand the value of alliances. He wasn't working alone anymore. He had partners, rival gang members, and even corrupt law enforcement officers on his side. In the criminal world, alliances could make or break an empire, and Tan was a master at maintaining these bonds. As the years passed, Tan's empire continued to grow. No longer just a small-time drug dealer, he had become a figure of fear and respect in both the criminal underworld and law enforcement circles. His operations spanned continents, but as with every criminal empire, the higher you rise, the more enemies you make. With more money came more attention, and as Tan's influence continued to expand, so did the risk of exposure. Yet for now, Yoni Tan remained untouchable. He had built a criminal empire that spanned Australia and beyond, and his power was only increasing. The drugs flowed freely, and Tan's grip on the trade seemed tighter than ever. Money piled up, and Yoni Tan's influence over the Australian underworld seemed unchallenged. His rise to power was swift, but it was no accident. Behind his meteoric ascent lay a sharp mind, a ruthless streak, and a willingness to take risks others wouldn't dare. As his network expanded and his operations grew more sophisticated, Tan solidified his position as one of the most influential figures in Australia's drug trade. But his climb wasn't without challenges, and during this period of rapid growth, Tan had to prove just how far he was willing to go to secure his reign. The heart of Tan's rise was his exceptional ability to build and manage relationships. As his business expanded beyond Melbourne, he quickly realized that the criminal world thrived on trust, loyalty, and mutual benefit. He wasn't just dealing with drugs, he was dealing with people, each with their own ambitions, fears, and desires. To maintain control over his empire, he needed to surround himself with individuals who could deliver results without hesitation. One of his greatest strengths was his knack for spotting talent, even in the most unlikely places. While some of his rivals stuck with the same old contacts, Tan had an uncanny ability to find the right people, individuals with the skills and, more importantly, the loyalty to help him take his operation to the next level. He didn't care about backgrounds or previous allegiances. If someone could help him achieve his goals, they were brought into the fold. This was especially evident in how he recruited his inner circle. Tan was a master manipulator, knowing exactly how to motivate people and make them feel valued. He understood that in the criminal world, power wasn't just about money. It was about control over people. He gave his trusted lieutenants autonomy over certain parts of the operation, but always kept a watchful eye to ensure loyalty remained strong. Even as the empire grew larger and more complex, it wasn't long before Tan began to extend his reach beyond just the drug trade. He understood that running a successful empire required more than just smuggling drugs. It required influence in multiple spheres of society. Tan began forging alliances with corrupt officials, from police officers to local politicians, ensuring that his operations could run with relative impunity. In exchange for bribes, favors, or sometimes protection, Tan built a network of allies that made his empire nearly untouchable at the same time. His reputation as a ruthless businessman spread. Rival gangs took notice of his success and began trying to encroach on his turf. But Tan wasn't one to back down from a fight. He had always been a fierce competitor, and the world of organized crime was no different. One of his earliest and most significant rivalries was with the notorious Albanian crime syndicate operating in Melbourne at the time. Although the Albanian group was a powerful player in the city's drug trade, they were no match for Tan's growing empire. Rather than resorting to an all-out war, Tan took a more subtle approach. He infiltrated their operation from within, using his network of loyal contacts to sow distrust among their leaders. Over time, Tan managed to weaken their position, forcing them into submission. Eventually, the Albanian syndicate either folded or agreed to work under Tan's leadership, further expanding his control over Melbourne. This victory wasn't just a business win. It was a message to everyone in the underworld. Yoni Tan was the new kingpin of Australian organized crime. With his rivals out of the way, Tan consolidated his power. He established connections with powerful players across Asia, the United States, and Europe. His reach had gone global, and his business was thriving. Despite his growing wealth and power, Tan remained a shadowy figure, preferring to stay out of the public eye. He rarely appeared at the scene of a deal or confrontation, instead allowing his lieutenants to handle the day-to-day operations. But as his power increased, so did the pressure. Law enforcement was becoming more determined to dismantle his empire. They knew the scale of his operations couldn't be ignored forever. Yet for years, Tan managed to stay one step ahead, using his network of informants and corrupt officials to evade detection. He had become a master of the game, a shadowy figure whose empire spanned continents, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. However, as with all empires, the cracks began to show. The higher you rise, the harder you fall, and Yoni Tan's empire was no exception. His rivals weren't giving up easily, and law enforcement, though slow to catch on, was beginning to close in. By the late 2000s, Tan's empire was well established, but the threat of law enforcement was growing. Despite his careful planning and vast network of informants, Tan could feel the pressure mounting. Australia's federal police and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission were starting to pay more attention to the country's drug trade. Seizures of drugs coming in from overseas were becoming more frequent, and authorities began to realize that the shipments were too well organized to be the work of smaller syndicates. They were dealing with something bigger, something far more powerful. But Tan had always been a step ahead, using his connections to keep a close watch on police activities. As his influence grew, so did his enemies. Rivals in the criminal underworld who had once respected Yoni Tan's rise to power now saw him as a threat. Unable to compete with his empire directly, some began working with authorities to bring him down. The first signs of trouble came in the form of anonymous tips and wiretaps. Yoni knew that the longer he stayed at the top, the more enemies he would make, not just among criminals, but within law enforcement too. One of his closest allies, a senior police officer who had protected his operations for years, became a liability. This officer, once loyal, started taking risks and making mistakes. Yoni quickly realized that betrayal was inevitable in the criminal world. He acted swiftly, severing ties quietly and ensuring that his former ally was dealt with discreetly, without attracting too much attention. Yoni had learned long ago that trust was both easily earned and quickly lost. Despite this, the first major blow to his operation came in 2009. Armed with intelligence from his rivals, authorities raided several of his warehouses in Melbourne. While they didn't find enough evidence to dismantle his entire empire, the raid sent a clear message. Law enforcement was starting to take him seriously. But Yoni didn't panic. His network had become a well-oiled machine, and despite the crackdown, his empire remained intact. He quickly restructured his operations, moving key figures into new roles and tightening security across his distribution channels. Despite the looming threat from law enforcement, Yoni Tan's ambition had no limits. By this time, his network stretched beyond Australia's borders, reaching Southeast Asia and even parts of Europe. Some of his closest associates were arrested, but many others managed to evade capture. His influence remained on the streets. While authorities celebrated their progress, they knew that the structure Yoni had built, with its vast network of dealers, suppliers, and corrupt officials, wouldn't crumble overnight. As the cracks in his empire appeared, new players quickly filled the void, operating on a smaller scale but still connected to Tan's legacy. That in the years that followed, some elements of his organization continued operating, albeit with less coordination and higher risks. Authorities ramped up their efforts to target the remnants of his operation, arresting former associates and cracking down on remaining drug shipments. Many of Tan's former allies, now in hiding, watched from the shadows as their once thriving empire dwindled. But Yoni's story wasn't just about being a criminal mastermind. It was about ambition, power, and the inevitable cost of trying to maintain control. While they had arrested Yoni, law enforcement knew they hadn't fully dismantled the networks he had created. For Yoni Tan, however, the fight ended in prison. He faced the consequences of his actions, and his once powerful network was now broken. The world he had controlled was beyond his reach, but even in captivity, Yoni never stopped strategizing. He knew the underworld all too well, and his story, his legacy, would continue to inspire those who followed in his footsteps. The legacy of Yoni Tan still lingers in the shadows of Australia's criminal world. Though his reign was short-lived, his influence shaped the way organized crime operates in the country. The myth of Yoni Tan, the man who built an empire from the ground up, continues to resonate with those who follow his path. While law enforcement succeeded in capturing him, they could never erase the lessons he imparted on the criminal world. Yoni understood the intricacies of power, how to build trust, maintain loyalty, and outsmart rivals in the years following his arrest. Investigators continued to uncover the vast scale of his operations. From his extensive network of dealers and corrupt officials to the global reach of his drug shipments, Yoni's empire was more extensive than anyone had realized. For some, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is truly untouchable. For others, he was a hero. His rise from the streets of Melbourne to the pinnacle of Australia's criminal underworld was a story of ambition and cunning. But his story wasn't just about crime. it was also about survival. Despite his fall from grace, Yoni's impact on the criminal world endured. His name became synonymous with ruthless ambition, a driving force that fuels the dark underworld. As Yoni Tan remains behind bars, his legacy lives on in the minds of those who came after him. His empire may have crumbled, but the lessons he taught about power, loyalty, and survival have left an indelible mark on the criminal landscape of Australia. The story of Yoni Tan is not just the tale of a drug lord. It's the story of a man who built an empire on ambition, fought for control, and ultimately paid the price for it all. His rise and fall serve as a stark reminder that no matter how high you rise, the fall is always waiting just around the corner.